Every era has a truth regime, a set of normative assumptions which set the boundaries of thought and police the parameters of allowable opinion. In the medieval era, for example, the overwhelming majority of people in Europe subscribed to an idea called the Great Chain of Being, with God at the top in heaven and Satan at the bottom in hell. Such was the ubiquity of this way of thinking in this period that certain thoughts and concepts that came outside of this framework were not only completely off limits, but also quite literally unthinkable for most people. We can call this the medieval truth regime. But as the events of history took their shape, as the church became more corrupt and abused its power, as discoveries in science and exploration gained momentum, and as the spirit of the age seemed to change profoundly, the old truth regime started to fall apart. The old ideas could no longer serve, and more people came to question them, until, in the end, there was a new truth regime. And when this happens, we see a revolution of the elites. Truth regimes, always and everywhere, find their ideological defenders in the intellectual class. These people disseminate and control the flow of information. They are the handmaidens of power. They help to maintain the status quo by policing the boundaries of what is thinkable. And accordingly, the questioning of a truth regime begins with renegade intellectuals who are able to jam the flow of information with news signals which scramble and question the status quo. At first, the renegade intellectuals will be persecuted as heretics, but as these ideas gain more purchase, generally as they are picked up by artists and disseminated in culture, they start to penetrate the institutions of the status quo. And as these ideas spread to more and more people, the old ideas can no longer serve. More and more people question them, until, in the end, there is a new truth regime, and we get another revolution of elites. Such a revolution took place following the Second World War. The old truth regime, which had been built on notions such as duty, patriotism, and respect for the family, came to be seen as old-fashioned and outmoded by renegade intellectuals in the 1950s and 1960s, and so a new truth regime emerged in which there was a new ultimate good and a new ultimate evil. The ultimate good was the idea of unlimited individual self-expression as embodied in the ideals of the 1960s, as John Lennon sung in his song, "God, I just believe in me, Yoko and me, and that's reality."
I don't believe in magic. I don't believe in hatching. I don't believe in Bible. I don't believe in tarot. I don't believe in Hitler. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe in Kennedys. I don't believe in Buddha. I don't believe in mantra. I don't believe in Gita. I don't believe in yoga. I don't believe in kings. I don't believe in Elvis. I don't believe in Zimmerman. I don't believe in Beatles. I just believe in me. Yoko and me. And that's reality.
In this vision, the nihilistic worship of the self becomes the ultimate good. As Patti Smith sang, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. My sins my own, they belong to me. Me.
Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. Milton, pot of thieves, wild cord of my sleeve, thick heart of stone, my sins my own, they belong to me.
This is the deracinated individual, shorn of history, culture, religion, a new man for a new age. Right now, we are only seeing the logical next steps in a society in which this idea is the ultimate moral good. But what is the ultimate evil in this truth regime? All fingers point back to its mythical foundations in World War II, which pits the good, plucky British, as embodied in the figure of Winston Churchill and their American allies, against the evil Nazis as embodied in the figure of Adolf Hitler, who, in a moral system that values individual self-expression, is quite literally Satan. His creed, one based on racial identity, in-group interests, suspicion and active persecution of outsiders, a view of man as predator or as prey, against multiculturalism, against moral relativism, against globalism. In the view of the Boomer truth regime, this view is a creed of evil. It is important to understand the full implications of this, because within the Boomer truth regime, the left wing has stood for the ultimate good of the deracinated individual self-expression, while the right wing has stood against the ultimate evil of Adolf Hitler. The patriotism of the right wing is a patriotism that says we fought a war of good against evil, as defined by the Boomer truth regime. Thus, when George W. Bush declared a war on terror, it was a war waged by a supposed right-wing American patriotism against the evil of Islamists in the Middle East. Islamists who were evil precisely because they, like Hitler, opposed globalism and a view of humans as deracinated individuals freed from religion, history, culture, and so on, and living only for their self-expression. Now, while this truth regime may have suited the 1960s and may have even suited the 1990s when I was a teenager, it may be the case that we are coming to the end of its life cycle. Those intellectuals who speak out against it have been heretics, but their voices are becoming more difficult to drown out. And there are signs that a new truth regime, and with it a revolution of the elites, will come sooner or later. In my view, those people looking to smash the Boomer truth regime commit errors when they attack it head-on. For example, it is no good trying to rehabilitate Hitler. For example, we need not denigrate the Beatles. These symbols, which are at the foundations of the Boomer worldview, maintain extraordinary power and cultural capital. But also, if you focus on these, it will likely drown out important new truths by getting bogged down in historical specifics. It would be the worst thing in the world to get yourself trapped in a debate with a World War II expert or someone who can name the make and model of George Harrison's guitars. I was there watching Eric Clapton in 1967, man, yada yada yada. This sort of thing is a waste of your time. You need to step over it. Step over all of it.
That whatever occurred and whatever occurs, we don't have to apologise. We step over what exists.
It is not useful in any way. What is much more important is to find new symbols, new ways of expressing things, new forms in which we can rehabilitate concepts that the Boomer truth regime has suppressed or put so far out of mind as to be completely unthinkable. For this, you need a new language shorn of historical baggage, a new way of framing things that cannot be reduced to what happened in the 1940s, a new paradigm that leaves the old one shattered and toothless, ashes in the dustbin of history. And once this has been achieved, the mental trap of the boomer truth regime will be over. Now get out. Recently, I've been talking about the importance of smashing the boomer truth regime. If you don't know what that means, I have a video explaining this concept which I've linked in the show notes. I am going to embark on a series in which I will be trying to deconstruct some of the specifics of the boomer truth regime in situ through some meta-analysis of old archival footage. For this first effort, I've chosen a public service film from 1952 commissioned by the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's about the community in a little town in New York called Millwood. However, before we start the analysis, I'm going to be attempting something fairly ambitious here, which is that we'll be looking at the footage on at least 4 different layers.
Listen to me. May I compartmentalise? I hate to, but may I?
First, there is the straightforward level of looking at this film from the point of view of what its makers were trying to achieve in 1952. But then there are 3 further lenses which come extrinsically from the vantage point of watching this now in 2020. These lenses represent the 3 different faces of the boomer truth regime. And to try to make this simple to conceptualize, I've personified them as 3 characters: Boomer Waylon, Gen X Daria, and Millennial Madison. Boomer Waylon sees the past as a form of repression and wants to be free to do what he wants any old time. Gen X Daria is extremely cynical and is so wise to the world that she can see someone trying to con her a mile off. And of course, Millennial Madison is woke to the patriarchy, systemic racism, and the problem of our white colonial past. And I want you, as you watch this film, to keep the voices of these 3 characters at the front of your mind, to imagine how their social conditioning might jam the signals and values this old film was trying to project. I will be pausing the film at intervals with my own analysis, but I'd also like to know your own ideas, which you can put in the comments. So with all that said, let's make a start.
Fall has come to Millwood, the city where Richard Anderson lives. A city neither small nor large, simply a normal community where people live together, work together, and do things for each other. This is the story of one day in Millwood, just any day. The story begins at daybreak. All is quiet in the Anderson home. Everybody is asleep. It is still some time before Richard has to get up for breakfast. But while most people are still asleep, many are at work, doing things for other people, things which mean a great deal to the others, including Richard himself. While Richard sleeps, the men at the dairy are filling bottles with fresh milk, and long before daybreak, Richard's milkman picks up the milk and delivers it to the Anderson home in time for breakfast. All night long, the bakers have been baking the bread for today, bread which the delivery man now takes to stores and homes.
So already, just in these opening moments, notice how the film frames the activities of the milkman and the baker as cooperation, people doing things for each other, utilizing specialization under the division of labor, which is afforded by the market process. This is how Adam Smith might have described it, or indeed how Ludwig von Mises was describing the market in 1952 in his talks up and down the USA. The market process as social cooperation and the basis for community and civilization in a natural harmony is the story that Ludwig von Mises told in his speeches around this time, such as those collected in Planning for Freedom, Let the Market System Work, which you can now find published by Liberty Fund. And it is already interesting watching this, that a positive vision of the market, almost identical to that articulated by Mises, was basically mainstream here. But old Boomer Whalon already would not like the idea that the milkman or the baker were engaged in social cooperation by taking part in this system. "You're a slave to the system, man," he'd say, "and besides, these guys are probably working for someone else for a small wage and trapped by materialism. They've got to free their minds, man, from the chains of oppression." He'd already be thinking along these lines. Gen X Daria, meanwhile, would be narked that no mention has been made yet of profit. "These fellows aren't making milk and bread out of the goodness of their hearts," she'd say. "Even Adam Smith said that," she'd say. "Don't make out like this town is all cuddly and nice when it's all being driven by selfishness." And then Millennial Medicine would already have clocked that only a few minutes in, we've only heard from a white man, that's the narrator, and only seen white males on screen, mostly men and one little boy. No people of colour in Millwood, and no women at work that we've seen yet either. And so we've scarcely started and their hackles are already up. Let's continue.
Long before stores and schools open, trucks are bringing food for Richard's dinner into town from nearby farms and distant places. And from a refrigerator truck, the butcher is already unloading meat. Some of it will be on Richard's table today or tomorrow. Yes, Richard's community is always at work. All night long in the telephone building, operators have been busy at the switchboards putting through telephone calls that people need to make during the night, perhaps to a doctor or to a fire station.
It's probably worth mentioning here very quickly that Millennial Medicine would likely have some objection to the fact that the first women we see are in stereotypically female jobs like a switchboard operator, even though the only men we've seen so far have been blue-collar workers. She'd say something like, it's setting up a gender norm that men do manual work, but women are fit only to put calls through to supposedly male doctors.
In the city's water plant, pumps are running day and night to keep Millwood's reservoirs filled. Men keep checking gauges so that Richard or anyone else can be sure to get water at any time. At the power plant nearby, engineers keep watch all through the night so that there will be electricity whenever Richard or others need it. At the post office, men work all night sorting out the mail for each mailman so that the letters will be in the right place when Richard's mailman comes to work in the morning. Throughout much of the night at the newspaper office, men and women work hard to meet the deadline for Millwood's morning paper. Editors and reporters write stories that must be set into type on a machine called the linotype.
It's interesting, isn't it, that even half the journalists seem to be women even back then. It's also interesting that the framing from 1952 would suggest that these journalists were engaged in a useful function, namely bringing the citizens of Millwood the news and important events of the nation and indeed the world to them. Whereas I think Boomer Whalon, Gen X Daria and Millennial Madison would be united in thinking of the newspapers as ideological propaganda first and news only second. There's an implicit trust here that was obviously weakened and broken as time wore on.
Trained craftsmen operate the linotype machines. Their skilled hands set the news into printed lines one by one until they make up whole pages, which other men mount onto the big printing press. Just before daylight, The pressman checks the first copies as the newspapers roll off the great press. Other men bundle the papers, and still others deliver them to newsstands, counters, and homes all over Richard City. Getting up time is coming closer. The newsboy is already riding down the street and delivering the paper to Richard's home. But for Richard, the day is just beginning. For Richard and for most of the other people in Millwood. Every morning on his way to school, Richard sees the people of his community going about their jobs. People like the linemen, whose job it is to keep the electric lines in Millwood in good repair. Richard has really never stopped to think how people of his city depend on each other. Take this grocery store. His mother shops here, and he often comes to buy things from Mr. Shore, but he has never thought what the city would be like without a grocery store. Or what if there were no shoe stores in his community? Or no furniture stores? It's easy to see that the people who work in stores in the city are doing important work for their neighbors. Our community needs many kinds of people doing many kinds of work.
Now, this whole way of thinking is likely completely alien to the Boomer Truth regime. They are accustomed to thinking that all of these shops and services are in some way exploiting them, conning them into buying things they don't really want. The people working in these shops aren't helping their neighbours, they're being forced to work for a living, or else they'd starve. Gen X Daria might quip, "Yeah, but that's life," and is in fact the most at peace with this whole situation, even though in her heart she thinks it sucks, whereas Boomer Waylon and Millennial Madison have much deeper problems with it. Waylon thinks that there shouldn't be shops at all. Ideally, food would be free for everyone. Maybe people could live in real communities, like in a commune, say, rather than these fake ones like Millwood. Madison, meanwhile, thinks that the people of Millwood themselves don't deserve all this. The town was built on oppression. No black people are seen in this film, she'd say, and yet probably slaves built this place. In any case, this land was stolen from Native Americans, so little Richard Anderson is just a spoiled, entitled brat enjoying his little share of plunder while the rest of the world starves. Now, to anyone watching this, it should already be extraordinary the extent to which our three modern viewers are hostile to what seems a perfectly functioning, happy little community. So much anger and resentment, and yet all we've seen is people going about their lives in a safe and prosperous neighbourhood. Why must the modern mind perceive this particular past, which seems so pleasant, as somehow bad or even worse, actively evil? Why must this happy picture be torn down so vehemently, and why must these counter-narratives from Waylon, Daria and Madison jam the original signals being sent from 1952 so hard? Somewhat interesting to ponder, but let me suggest that it is because the narrative of progress cannot admit to itself that it may have taken wrong turns or made mistakes. The idea that things actually were like this in 1952, that things actually were quite good, that people really were quite happy in small town Anywhere USA, is for some reason unthinkable. And yet, one wonders for all that if things actually were better back then. Anyway,
there must be ways for people to go from one part of town to another. Some go by taxi. Some walk, of course. Many go in their own cars. Even more people use buses. They are a little slower, but easy to use and cost less than taxis. Autos, taxis, buses. These are the means of transportation in Richard City. Of course, there are bigger buses that go to many parts of the country. They stop in Millwood, too. And there is a railroad station where trains come in and go to other cities and towns. Trains which carry people, freight, and mail. Trucks carry mail to the post office from the station or from the helicopter field. Helicopters bring mail to Millwood from nearby suburbs and towns. They need little space to land on. That's why they are good for carrying mail. Helicopters hop from the large airport to a lot near the post office. They bring mail and take away mail to and from towns nearby and back again to the city airport. Its long blades lift the helicopter right off the field and whisk it away over houses to the next landing lot. Airplanes need larger airports than helicopters. That's why Millwood Airport is on the city's outskirts. Many people come to Richards City each day and many leave it by airplane. Although Richard has never thought about it, he too has an important job in his community, the job of going to school, so that he can learn some of the things which will make him a good citizen when he is ready to take his place in the community. No matter what a person does to earn his living, many people in the community depend on him, and he in turn depends on many other people. People who work in factories, making goods for the stores to sell. People who work in offices, writing letters or keeping books. Some of the people are craftsmen, and some are professional people, such as doctors and lawyers. Some are storekeepers. Many are housewives whose jobs are to manage their homes and take care of their children. Whatever a person does helps in little ways or in big ways to make his community a good place to live.
So I think I'm going to leave this here, although it does go on for a few minutes more. That final note is interesting. The idea of little Richard going to school in order to find his place in the community. The way this entire film is framed, every person we see is entirely at peace with their role in life. The milkman lives for delivering the milk, and he does not aspire to anything more. He's not looking for social mobility. He's looking to deliver milk to his community, and this in and of itself gives meaning and purpose to his existence. It reminds me a little bit of Calvin's notion of the calling, but it strikes me how alien this idea has become in the Boomer Truth regime. In the confines of this film, everyone has a place in the community, almost as if finding their place in the great chain of being. And this is natural, and this is good. But in the Boomer Truth regime, virtually no one is happy with their lot in life. Everyone strives to be something more, or else they seek to escape their lot altogether. In fact, in both Britain and America, excessive focus on social mobility and quote-unquote equality of opportunity, meaning more people going to university looking to become doctors and lawyers, while looking down on the working men that we see in this film, despite the fact that they carry out crucial functions without which we could not live. I think this was a negative aspect of the ideology of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, for example, and it might explain why Gen X Daria is so nonplussed, because Gen X Daria was told she could achieve anything at all in the world and yet faced the hard reality she was going to be perpetually disappointed. And it might explain why millennial Madison suffers from acute anxiety, because she has no certainty in life at all and can find no comfort in a society she is taught to hate as evil from its very foundations. Of course, Boomer Waylon is busy spending their inheritance and ensuring he cashes out his pension from that communal pot he was always so keen on, never once at any moment reflecting on the fact that it was his attitude, his rebellion against the essential perfection of Millwood Anywhere USA, that has made himself and everyone else so unhappy. And what I'm trying to do here is to get Waylon, to get Daria, and to get Madison to break from the chains of their own thought systems, and then to start thinking the unthinkable. That perhaps the view of the world that we get from this film is not some joke that is only there to be deconstructed and mocked as a relic of the past, but rather that it might contain some essential truths about what human beings are like and how they work best, which can then help to puncture the still childish idealism of the boomer, the tired cynicism of the Gen Xer, and the unbearable self-hatred of the millennial. Now get out. Last time on Deconstructing Boomer Truth, I focused on a small-time community in the 1950s. This was a nice gentle way into the series, and I think a lot of people were attracted to the idyllic lifestyle of the 1950s milkman depicted here. But on today's episode, I want to challenge you all a lot more and take you out of your comfort zone. And so for today, I've selected some excerpts from Madison Grant's book from 1916, The Passing of the Great Race. This book has been associated with eugenics and was known to be a favourite of Adolf Hitler's. The reason I have chosen it is because it represents more or less the polar opposite worldview from that of the Boomer Truth regime. It was written long before America rewrote its own history to be one of anti-racism, which was in fact partly a post hoc rationalization for its involvement in World War II, which was quite strongly resisted by the native population at the time. Once again, I will be using my three little characters here, Boomer Waylon, Gen X Daria, and Millennial Madison, to break down today's text. But we're also going to be, to some extent, seeing the Waylon, Daria, and Madison in ourselves, which is to say that some of the things Madison Grant brings up will be uncomfortable even for the most hardened so-called right-winger in 2020. So in Deconstructing Boomer Truth, we also come to see, to some extent, the boomer in ourselves. So let us begin.
There exists today a widespread and fatuous belief in the power of environment, as well as of education and opportunity to alter heredity, which arises from the dogma of the brotherhood of man, derived in its turn from the loose thinkers of the French Revolution and their American mimics. Such beliefs have done much damage in the past, and if allowed to go uncontradicted, may do even more serious damage in the future.
Just to say that it's interesting that such belief in the power of environment was as prevalent in 1916 as it is over 100 years later. Jean-Jacques Rousseau has a lot to answer for.
Thus, the view that the Negro slave was an unfortunate cousin of the white man, deeply tanned by the tropic sun and denied the blessings of Christianity and civilization, played no small part with the sentimentalists of the Civil War period, and it has taken us 50 years to learn that speaking English, wearing good clothes, and going to school and to church do not transform a Negro into a white man. Nor was a Syrian or Egyptian freedman transformed into a Roman by wearing a toga and applauding his favorite gladiator in the amphitheater. Americans will have a similar experience with the Polish Jew, whose dwarf stature, peculiar mentality, and ruthless concentration on self-interest are being engrafted upon the stock of the nation.
Here, Boomer Waylon would have the most basic response, which would be to object and say, we're all human, man. There is no black and white man. We're all the same underneath. There's just one race, the race of human beings. Perhaps some residual part of his brain might react, Richard Dawkins-like, to the fact that Grant is pinning this on utopian, universalist Christianity rather than his own brand of hippiedom, but he'd have no need to confront that. Maybe he'd think something like, well, man, religion has caused more wars than anything else, but that doesn't mean all people under the sun are not free and equal. The reference to the French thinkers that Grant is criticizing here would also likely be lost on him. Gen X Daria, I suspect, would try to respond by demonstrating that the claim isn't true. What about Uncle Phil on the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, she might say. It's just not true that black people can't be educated and join respectable society. But, of course, Daria is smart too. She'd understand that Uncle Phil might be an outlier, not typical, and might say something along the lines of black people still not having equality of opportunity. And outcomes won't start to look different until other societal factors are addressed. Note, though, that as much as Daria might try to frame her answer in terms of data and science, she still, in the final analysis, has to accept the idea that the root causes are environmental and not biological. She does then believe, ultimately, that the differences between white and black people are only skin deep. Her view, in the end, is identical to Waylon's, only dressed up, with a greater veneer of quote-unquote science. And finally, millennial medicine is quite interesting on this question because ultimately her worldview does assert that you cannot make a black person into a white person. The entire framework of social justice relies ultimately on an essentialized view of race, which paradoxically makes her the closest person here to Madison Grant, in so much as she recognizes race as a reality, whereas Waylon and Daria in some respects erase or efface race as a factor. However, Madison inverts Grant's way of seeing things. What Grant put down to biology, Madison puts down to structural oppression. What Grant sees as innate, Madison puts down to a singular unwillingness on the part of white people to share their power or resources with other races, power and resources which have been, in her view, stolen by force from those other races. Now, of course, anyone who watches this channel understands how prosperity is made and knows that this final claim is not true, economically speaking. But I think on a cultural level, millennial medicine might be getting at something else. Deep down, she believes that the person of color, or the Syrian, or the Egyptian, or indeed the Polish Jew, each have their own identity that will not and should not be assimilated into the power and truth regimes of the white man. But whereas Madison Grant might see this and seek to eject these people or to subjugate them, and where Waylon and Daria actually seek to efface their differences, millennial medicine wants to embolden them in their separate identities and actually hand them power from the whites as some sort of retribution for past transgressions. Quite how she does this while denying the biological basis for race, which is a more logical move for Waylon and Daria, but not for her, is remarkable. But nonetheless, she manages it by erecting a dual morality, whereby whiteness is uniquely evil and a power structure we are all trapped within, while every shade of non-whiteness creates its own specific point of resistance to that power structure. And so, by universalizing and abstracting the problem in this way, she never has to confront the fact that she has essentialized race in the same way that Madison Grant has, and this allows her to act as if race is real and essential, but then when questioned, to retreat back to the idea that it's all a construct of the evil white power regime made exactly by people like Grant himself. Okay, let's go back to the book.
In many countries, the existing classes represent races that were once distinct. In the city of New York and elsewhere in the United States, there is a Native American aristocracy.
Very quickly, when Grant says Native American, he means white people. And when he says Indian, he means what people call today Native American. Millennial medicine would be all over this naturally, but also I think Waylon and Daria would object to his use of the phrase lower races here for reasons I've discussed already.
Resting upon layer after layer of immigrants of lower races and these Native Americans, while, of course, disclaiming the distinction of a patrician class and lacking in class consciousness and class dignity, have nevertheless up to this time supplied the leaders in thought and in the control of capital, as well as of education and of the religious ideals and altruistic bias of the community. In the democratic forms of government, the operation of universal suffrage tends toward the selection of the average man for public office rather than the man qualified by birth, education, and integrity. How this scheme of administration will ultimately work out remains to be seen, but from a racial point of view, it will inevitably increase the preponderance of the lower types and cause a corresponding loss of efficiency in the community as a whole. The tendency in a democracy is toward a standardization of type and a diminution of the influence of genius. A majority must of necessity be inferior to a picked minority, and it always resents specializations in which it cannot share. In the French Revolution, the majority, calling itself the people, deliberately endeavored to destroy the higher type, and something of the same sort was in a measure done after the American Revolution by the expulsion of the Loyalists and the confiscation of their lands, with a resultant loss to the growing nation of good race strains, which were in the next century replaced by immigrants of far lower type. In America, we have nearly succeeded in destroying the privilege of birth. That is, the intellectual and moral advantage a man of good stock brings into the world with him. We are now engaged in destroying the privilege of wealth, that is, the reward of successful intelligence and industry, and in some quarters there is developing a tendency to attack the privilege of intellect, and to deprive a man of the advantage gained from an early and thorough classical education. Simplified spelling is a step in this direction.
So here, Waylon, as ever, would have level 1 reactions. Hey man, did you see how many wars kings started? There were a lot of bad kings in history. You say it's good stock, but how many kings and queens were inbred? And so on and so forth. Naturally, it wouldn't occur to Waylon that in making this sort of argument, he inadvertently reveals that he, deep down, accepts the underlying logic of genetics. But it was not the habit of his age to think about such contradictions. He'd also reject the claim that the advantages of wealth or education had been undermined or eliminated by pointing out that we're all still a slave to the man, and we still aren't truly free. This oppression is bullshit, man. Daria, meanwhile, would be characteristically more detached and less emotional. But the impulse is similar. There's no truth in it, she'd say. Look at history and see how did all those aristocracies end up. All those who oppressed other races have been dethroned. She might even concede Grant's point that democracy always gives us bad leaders, whereas the old aristocratic systems at least gave us a chance of some wise ones once in a while. But Daria is perfectly comfortable saying, yeah, it's shit, but that's life. Deal with it. Besides, whatever it is that Grant wants is in the past in any case. We are much more advanced now, and therefore this way of thinking is outmoded. It's just not realistic to imagine we could go back to thinking like that again. And for Daria, this might be her quote-unquote red pill. This is her looking through the matrix in her very cynical way and seeing the unvarnished truth. But interestingly stripped back, it's just the same truth that the generation of her father, the generation of Boomer Waylon, would have outlined, albeit dressed up with more stats and intelligence. Millennial medicine, though, she needed a bind here. White history is evil. Western man is evil. The European idea of progress is bullshit in her view. So how can she process this actual white supremacist pointing out that the process of capitalism and democracy have been in themselves regressive from his point of view? My suspicion is that this point would actually be beyond her. It would be lost on her. That's a little bit too much like thinking, which is much harder than repeating near-automatic slogans and mantras. And so instead, I think she would fixate on pointing out the racism and looking at a piece like this as proof that America was born in sin, and she'd leave it at that. But where does Grant go from here? Let's have a look.
Ignorance of English grammar or classic learning must not, forsooth, be held up as a reproach to the political or social aspirant. Mankind emerged from savagery and barbarianism under the leadership of selected individuals whose personal prowess, capacity, or wisdom gave them the right to lead and the power to compel obedience. Such leaders have always been a minute fraction of the whole, but as long as the tradition of their predominance persisted, they were able to use the brute strength of the unthinking herd as part of their own force, and were able to direct at will the blind dynamic impulse of the slaves, peasants, or lower classes. Such a despot had an enormous power at his disposal, which, if he were benevolent or even intelligent, could be used, and most frequently was used, for the general uplift of the race. Even those rulers who most abused this power put down with merciless rigor the anti-social elements, such as pirates, brigands, or anarchists, which impair the progress of a community, as disease or wounds cripple an individual. True aristocracy, or a true republic, is government by the wisest and best, always a small minority in any population. Human society is like a serpent dragging its long body on the ground, but with the head always thrust a little in advance and a little elevated above the earth. The serpent's tail in human society, represented by the antisocial forces, was in the past dragged by sheer strength along the path of progress. Such has been the organization of mankind from the beginning, and such it still is in older communities than ours. What progress humanity can make under the control of universal suffrage, or the rule of the average, may find a further analogy in the habits of certain snakes, which wiggle sideways, and disregard the head with its brains and eyes. Such serpents, however, are not noted for their ability to make rapid progress. A true republic, the function of which is administration in the interests of the whole community, in contrast to a pure democracy, which in last analysis is the rule of the demos or a majority in its own interests, should be, and often is, the medium of selection for the technical task of government of those best qualified by antecedents, character, and education, in short, of experts. To use another simile, in an aristocratic as distinguished from a plutocratic or democratic organization, the intellectual and talented classes form the point of the lance, while the massive shaft represents the body of the population, and adds by its bulk and weight to the penetrative impact of the tip. In a democratic system, this concentrated force is dispersed throughout the mass. It supplies, to be sure, a certain amount of leaven, but in the long run the force and genius of the small minority is dissipated, and its efficiency lost. Vox populi, so far from being vox dei, thus becomes an unending wail for rights and never a chant of duty.
Now this is making largely the same argument, but in a more poetic way, using this metaphor of a serpent, its head, its body, and its tail for the wisest, the masses, and the worst among us, respectively. So we don't really need to retrace all of the various responses, but I suspect that Daria would feel compelled to point out the scientific advances since 1945 as some way of disproving Grant. Whelan, I imagine, just zones out here. He can't concentrate for this long, but some aspect of millennial medicine actually agrees with this. This is quite literally her own view of the situation. It's just that what she wants is the 180-degree inversion of what Grant wants. Only her idea of the wisest is some woke activist professor. If Madison Grant could time travel 100 years into the future, he'd see his namesake as the proof of the degenerative process of democracy. He'd argue that everything this millennial believes is the total inversion of the truth, putting the lowest orders on top while all but eliminating the quote-unquote wisest from power and even from society altogether. Meanwhile, for Madison herself, Grant is the gift from history that seems to prove everything that she's been saying. I leave it for you to decide who you most identify with on this and move on.
Where a conquering race is imposed on another race, the institution of slavery often arises to compel the servient race to work and to introduce it forcibly to a higher form of civilization. As soon as men can be induced to labor to supply their own needs, slavery becomes wasteful and tends to vanish. From a material point of view, slaves are often more fortunate than freemen when treated with reasonable humanity, and when their elemental wants of food, clothing, and shelter are supplied. The Indians around the fur posts in northern Canada were formerly the virtual bond slaves of the Hudson Bay Company, each Indian and his squaw and papoose being adequately supplied with simple food and equipment. He was protected as well against the white man's rum, as the red man's scalping parties, and in return gave the company all his peltries, the whole product of his year's work. From an Indian's point of view, this was nearly an ideal condition, but was to all intents serfdom or slavery. when through the opening up of the country the continuance of such an archaic system became an impossibility, the Indian sold his furs to the highest bidder, received a large price in cash, and then wasted the proceeds in trinkets instead of blankets, and in rum instead of flour, with the result that he is now gloriously free, but is on the high road to becoming a diseased outcast. In this case of the Hudson Bay Indian, the advantages of the upward step from serfdom to freedom are not altogether clear. A very similar condition of vassalage existed until recently among the peons of Mexico, but without the compensation of the control of an intelligent and provident ruling class. In the same way, serfdom in medieval Europe apparently was a device through which the landowners repressed the nomadic instinct in their tenantry, which became marked when the fertility of the land declined after the dissolution of the Roman Empire. Years are required to bring land to its highest productivity, and agriculture cannot be successfully practiced even in well-watered and fertile districts by farmers who continually drift from one locality to another. The serf or villain was therefore tied by law to the land, and could not leave except with his master's consent. As soon as the nomadic instinct was eliminated, serfdom vanished. One has but to read the severe laws against vagrancy in England just before the Reformation to realize how widespread and serious was this nomadic instinct.
And so this part of Grant's argument is the one I suspect that will be the most triggering to virtually anyone and everyone watching this. And before I go on, let me make it abundantly clear that I think that slavery is morally abhorrent and indefensible, and as a staunch classical liberal, think it is a very great thing that it was abolished. But, and there is a but, Grant is getting at some rather uncomfortable facts here. His point that some slaves were materially better off and even happier before their emancipation is something we can see in the historical record. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Library of Congress interviewed hundreds of former slaves. Most of these were old people in their 80s, 90s, some of them even over 100 years old, with memories of the US Civil War. Many of them had fought in that war, and reading these first-hand accounts of slavery is quite eye-opening. In fact, such is the picture that we get from them that the website which hosts them puts a disclaimer in the introduction explaining why so many of these accounts paint a rosier picture than we might expect. It says, "Certainly, the interviews in the slave narrative collection present problems beyond the general issue of reliability and accuracy of recollections of the past. Not only had more than 70 years elapsed between emancipation and the time of the interviews, but most informants had experienced slavery only as children or adolescents. Those interviews were extremely old, and most were living in conditions of abject poverty during the Depression years of the 1930s. These factors often combined to make them look upon the past through rose-coloured glasses. They fondly described events and situations that had not been in reality so positive as they recalled them. Moreover, it is apparent that some informants, mistaking the interviewer for a government representative who might somehow assist them in their economic plight, replied to questions with flattery and calculated exaggeration in an effort to curry the interviewer's favour. Exaggeration may often have been the consequence of the interview itself, which gave informants an opportunity to be the centre of attention." Now, it's interesting to me that here we see a little glitch in the matrix. We are supposed to believe that slavery is an ultimate evil, which I actually do think, by the way. Maybe this is the boomer in me, but yet the actual accounts of slavery from former slaves do not paint it in an entirely negative light. The impulse of the boomer truth regime is immediately to pathologize this, to psychologize it, to explain that somehow they're old black people in the 1930s and 40s and they didn't really mean or believe the things they said, that their memories were defective in some way. I note that the suggestion that good things might have been exaggerated is front and centre here, but the suggestion that tales of brutality might have been exaggerated is not. Well, as it happens, I've spent a good number of hours looking over some of these testimonies, and a few things stood out to me. First is that despite the disclaimer here, there are many tales of genuine brutality that are very difficult to read. I won't share them, but they made me feel quite angry at the sheer sadism of it all. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, for example, you already know the half of it. But it was also interesting that these tales, the tales of bad masters, seem to be the exception rather than the rule. And also that such tales were nearly always second-hand accounts, which is to say it was somebody repeating a story they were told by a parent or of something happening on another plantation. There's one story, for example, of the KKK stringing up a man's wife on a tree and stabbing her to death, and then this man got a rifle and killed 14 Klansmen in revenge. Now, obviously, this is a remarkable story, but one can see how something like that might have been the stuff of legend in some of these communities. The majority of the testimonies are much more like this. People pointing out that their masters were very kind, that they were never hurt by any of them, and that they were relatively happy living on the plantation, and so on and so forth. And also that while they were excited when the Civil War came and to join the forces of Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, freedom actually resulted in more hardship than they'd known before. As this account says, after the Civil War, the slaves, who were for the most part uncivilized and ignorant, found it very difficult to adjust themselves to their new life as free persons. Formerly, they lived on the land of their masters, and although compelled to work long hours, their food and lodging were provided for them. After their emancipation, this life was changed. They were free and had to think for themselves and make a living. Times for the Negro then were much the same as during the Depression. Several of the slaves sought it out to secure jobs, but all found it difficult to adjust themselves to the new life and difficult to secure employment. Many came back to their old owners, and many were afraid to leave and continued on much as before. And this goes back to Madison Grant's point about the Hudson Bay Indians. If you're broke, if you're addicted to rum, if you're addicted to gambling, is being free really all it's cracked up to be? How would our three characters answer this, and how might you answer it? Boomer Waylon might even argue that getting drunk under the stars is freedom, man, and maybe he's thinking of his own time at Woodstock or some other festival getting wasted on drugs. As we've seen, Waylon is not a particularly deep thinker, and it would never occur to him that these hedonistic choices like drink, drugs, and so on are in themselves a form of trap, a form of control, a form of oppression. Daria, meanwhile, might struggle with this a little bit more. She has seen the mistakes of Waylon up close and privately knows not to repeat them. But she would rationalize it by saying that the freedom to fail, the freedom to mess up, is the price you pay for freedom. In other words, it's a trade-off. More freedom in exchange for less security. She might also ask this question: would you choose to be a slave or a serf? You're very safe in prison, but would you give up your freedom to go there? And here the cynicism of self-interest is used as the ultimate trump card. Now, I suspect a lot of people viewing this will be thinking along similar lines. But where is Madison Grant even coming from with this view? Is he just a bad old white supremacist with nothing of any value whatsoever to tell us? Well, I think he's appealing to a very old idea that very much rankles with our modern sensibilities, namely, it's for your own good. And the related idea of the feudal notion of service or bondage, which is the idea that people might ultimately feel more fulfilled serving something bigger than themselves, like a wise master. We glimpse this idea a little bit in pop culture. Think of Daniel San and Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, or Luke Skywalker and Yoda, or the Master in Kill Bill. The image is often orientalized and limited to something like martial arts, which makes it somewhere over there and therefore safe. But this is the residual force of the ancient idea that Grant is appealing to. And studies have shown a long-term decline in happiness as the social bonds that he's talking about have been broken. Note in these graphs the fact that happiness went down during the greater freedom of the swinging 60s and actually went up with the election of Adolf Hitler in Germany and the lesser freedom that resulted from that. As women have been granted greater freedom, their happiness relative to men has decreased. So-called deaths of despair as well as suicides have skyrocketed since 1890. People have become more angry, sadder, and feel more shame now than they ever did in the past. Although, interestingly, there seems to be an uptick in quote-unquote joy, too. Could that be the Star Wars toy box opening or viral cat videos? Well, who knows? But it might just be possible that in abolishing some of these terrible old institutions, such as slavery, the Boomer Truth regime also threw out the baby with the bathwater, which is to say that old concepts such as service, loyalty, duty, and so on, practically missing in today's world, may very well have made people feel safer and happier. Let me know what you think. Now get out.
Here is the clock, the Trumpton clock, telling the time steadily, sensibly, never too quickly, never too slowly, telling the time for Trumpton.
Steadily, sensibly, just like a clock, an ordered world and an order that exists just for Trumpton. Today I'm going to be comparing Trumpton, which was a kids show that aired here in Britain in the 1960s, with Raggy Dolls, a kids show that aired here in Britain in the late 1980s when I was a kid. And I'm going to be giving Boomer Waylon, Gen X Daria, and Millennial Medicine the episode off this week because I want to focus on some of the socialization techniques that each of them had to face. Trumpton was a show that was made by a member of the silent generation, a man who was born in 1921, Gordon Murray, who was quoted as saying, "Children grow up far too soon. Before you know it, they're having condoms handed out in class. It's not a world that encourages them to be people." So you could say that Trumpton has an explicit conservative agenda. So what about Raggy Dolls then?
It's not much of a life when you're just a pretty face.
Just to be whoever you are is no disgrace. Don't be scared if you don't fit in. Look who's in the reject bin. It's the Raggy Dolls.
Raggy Dolls.
Raggy Dolls.
Raggy Dolls.
Where Trumpton starts with the cosmic ordering of time, a frame that automatically places us in a situation where there are principles bigger than any one person, Raggy Dolls starts with this unmistakably boomerish paean to the self, sung by Neil Innes, hero of the Boomer Truth regime, who also provided the script for this series. He's famous, of course, for working with Monty Python. But let's think about what he's saying. It's not much of a life when you're just a pretty face. Just to be whoever you are is no disgrace. So the very first line rejects the ancient standard of beauty and reduces it to just a pretty face. Being beautiful, then, is a shallow quality, but to be whoever you are, warts and all, that's something to be lauded. That's something wonderful. And it continues, don't be scared if you don't fit in. Look who's in the reject bin. It's the raggy dolls, dolls like you and me. The call here is to disregard social norms, to disregard what other people think, to embrace the idea of yourself, whatever your flaws, as unique and special, and to accept, paradoxically, that basically everyone else is also flawed, also unique, and also special. And this is a near-perfect encapsulation of the half-baked cod philosophy that stands in for a worldview at the centre of the Boomer Truth regime. And as Thomas Tripp the milkman from Camberwick Green passes by on his daily delivery, we see this community in which everyone has their role to play in the great chain of being, in which the policeman has respect, in which the authority of the mayor is unquestioned, in which the milkman, the baker, the printer, the flower woman, and so on, each respond to their sacred calling by proving their worth to the whole community through being useful to their fellow man. And so we see that each person in Trumpton, even before the episode has started, is defined by their social bonds, by their relationship to the whole of the community, and not, to quote Raggy Dolls, to be whoever they are. This is a vision of an ordered society, a society ordered by time, a society ordered by hierarchy, a society ordered by the inherent worth of the local community.
Mrs. Cobbett is in her usual place with her basket of flowers. Here's the mayor to buy his buttonhole. Miss Lovelace wants some flowers for her hat shop. Everyone knows Mrs. Cobbett. The market square just wouldn't be the same place without her. But one morning, Mrs. Cobbett didn't come. There was no buttonhole for the mayor. There were no flowers for Miss Lovelace. Hello, says Chippy Minton. Where's Mrs. Cobbett then? Nobody knew. Morning, Chippy, says Mr. Munnings. Come to mend my broken chair? That's right, says Chippy. If Mr. Munnings wouldn't mind waiting for his chair, I could pop along and see what's happened to Mrs. Cobbett. She lives next door to me. Mr. Munnings doesn't mind at all, and the mayor thinks it's a splendid idea. So off go Chippy and Nibs in the little van.
Notice here how, although everyone is defined by what they can do for everyone else, a great disruption to the order of Trumpton has taken place. Mrs. Cobbett, a fixture of the village square and a pillar in this community, is missing. And so people are willing to put aside their immediate short-term interest to see what has happened. They each here put the community before themselves, despite that community resting on each of their own separate interests. Let's see what happens.
Oh, Chippy, says Mrs. Minton, I've been that worried about Mrs. Cobbett. There's this great branch fallen off the tree clean through her roof. I wonder you didn't notice it when you went out this morning. I always said about that old tree. Yes, yes, dear, never mind that now. Wonder if I ought to break the door down or something. She might be hurt in there. Here she is. Here she is, cries Nibs, and out comes Mrs. Cobbett herself, unhurt, but very dusty. Are you all right? They ask. Perfectly all right, thank you, my dears, she says. Just a mite dusty, that's all. It's my poor flowers I'm worried about. I just put the basket ready when crash, bang, down comes the ceiling. Great lumps of plaster and stuff all over the place and the flowers all crushed to bits. I've been all this time cleaning up and sorting out what's left. Poor Mrs. Cobbett, says Mrs. Minton. Let me help you clear up. That's very kind, but I must get to the market square. I've never missed a day there for 40 years, only Sundays. Hop into my van then, Mrs. Cobbett, says Chippy. I'll have you there in no time. But what's this? A shiny ice cream van has taken Mrs. Cobbett's place by the statue in the market square.
Now, it cannot be underestimated what a massive threat Tony is here to life as everyone knows it in Trumpton. Mrs. Cobbett has just told us that she hasn't missed a day selling flowers in 40 years. And now this interloper, this outsider, who one suspects may also be a foreigner, an Italian, has stolen his spot and started selling a new product. It's a cruel invasion of capitalism, of modernity, of the outside world into this safe and cosy village. So how will the community deal with this? Let's see.
This is too much, says Mrs. Cobbett, and bursts into tears. There, there, says Chippy, don't take on so. But Mrs. Cobbett is taking on. Everyone comes out to see what's the matter. Even the mayor comes out, although he is thinking mostly of his buttonhole. Ah, Mrs. Cobbett, there you are, he says. I'll have a red carnation, please. I haven't got a red carnation, sobs Mrs. Cobbett, and I haven't got a place to sell what few flowers I have got. Chippy Minton explains to the mayor about Mrs. Cobbett and the damaged flowers, but nobody can explain about the ice cream van. I'm terribly sorry, says the ice cream man. It just looked like a good spot to sell ice cream. Tell you what, Mrs. Cobbett, he says, if you will step into my van and sell my ice creams for me this morning, I will go and plaster your ceiling for you. Now, how's that? That's ever so kind, says Mrs. Cobbett. And I'll mend the rafters, offers Chippy Minton, if Mr. Munnings will wait a bit longer for his chair. By all means, says Mr. Munnings, but I thought you said there was a branch sticking through the roof. Won't it have to be moved before you can do the ceiling? Nobody had thought of that. Leave it to me, says the mayor. I shall summon the fire brigade. Mr. Troop, kindly go and ring up Captain Flack. Ask him to remove the obstacle at once. Yes, your worship, says Mr. Troop.
And we don't need to play out the whole rest of the episode to see how this plan works. With a single stroke, Mr. Antonio, the ice cream man, endears himself to the entire community by, as the economist Ronald Coase would call it, internalising the externality. Mrs. Cobbett turns out to be amazing at selling ice creams, and despite losing her entire stock of flowers and having a tree fall onto the roof of her house, ends up landing on her feet because the entire community helps her out. What's remarkable about the solution found here is that it relies on the absolute trust within this community, which is readily understood and taken for granted by all. And Mr. Antonio, the outsider coming in, can see that and buys into it and becomes a part of it. And so, after helping Mrs. Cobbett out of a tight spot, he earns the trust of everyone in the town. And it's much easier for them to accept him, despite his difference from them, after this. But there is also absolutely no question of what the expected social and moral norms are here. If Mr. Antonio had reacted in a different way, one might wonder what the citizens of Trumpton might have done.
One morning, Claude put 7 eggs into a saucepan.
Good, thought Sad Sack. Boiled eggs for breakfast. My favourite.
The clock ticked away. 1, 2, 3 minutes.
I like them when the yellow's all runny.
Immediately, can I just point out the different relationship that Sadsack has with time here from the citizens of Trompton? Whereas in Trompton, the clock looms over the town as an ordering principle. Here in Raggy Dolls, time is just a barrier between Sadsack getting to eat his eggs. Or does he get to eat them?
Said Sadsack, licking his lips. Excusez-moi?
Another half a minute, and they'll be just right.
These eggs are not for eating, said Claude.
Not for eating?
No, said Dotty, who was collecting spoons from a drawer. They are for running, explained Claude.
Running?
We're having a Raggy Doll sports day, said Dotty. And the first race is going to be an egg and spoon race. So boil those eggs really hard, Claude.
I'm not running in any races,
said Sadsack. Oh, yes, you are. We're all running, said Dotty. Quite a crowd had gathered in the field. It was the first time the Raggy Dolls had held a sports day. A rabbit announced the first race.
The first race will be an egg and spoon race,
he called. His voice boomed so loud through the megaphone that it was difficult to understand what he was saying. But the Raggy Dolls were already lining up at the start.
Look at that shot right there. That's the Boomer Truth Regime dream in one shot. 7 different people, diversity you might say, each with their own little quirks that make them special. This was the idea that was pumped into us over and over and over again as kids. Over and over again. You're an individual. You're special. The things that make you you should be lauded. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Over and over again. Oh, you know, you don't want to be normal. Who wants to be normal? You know, all of it, that's the idea. Over and over. This right here is the Boomer dream.
They each had an egg and a spoon, and the rabbit called,
"Get ready! Get set! Go!"
and blew his whistle. Off they raced. "Come on, Claude! Come on, Dotty! Princess! Lucy! Keep at it! Run! Run!" yelled the crowd. The Raggy Dolls kept bumping into each other because their eyes were on their eggs. But it was soon clear who would win. "Well done," panted Dotty.
"I could see I was in front, so I just kept going,"
explained back to front. Sadsack was still in the middle of the field, picking up his egg for the 100th time. "The race is over!" called Dotty. "You can stop running!" crackled Hi-Fi. "Someone had to be last," said Lucy kindly.
"The next race is a sack race,"
announced the rabbit.
"A what race?"
gasped Sadsack. "A sack race," explained Dotty. "We have to get into sacks and hop. But you won't need to get in a sack because you're a sack already."
"I'm not hopping anywhere,"
said Sadsack. "Spoil sport," snapped Dotty again.
"I'm not a spoil sport."
"Yes, you are."
"No, I'm not."
"You are."
"I'm not."
"Prove it then."
"I will too."
Incidentally, Dotty was always an immensely overbearing, bossy bitch in this show, and always assumed the leadership role, effectively dominating everyone else in every single communication. I doubt Neil Innes or anyone else was thinking about this at the time, but it's interesting now to look back on the idea that we'd be having overbearing women telling us what to do all the time.
Said Sadsack.
"On your marks, everyone. Get ready. Get set. Go!"
boomed the rabbit. The Raggy Dolls hopped like kangaroos. First Claude led the field, then Hi-Fi, then Lucy, who was carrying one of her legs because she said it was easier to hop that way. "Lucy, Lucy, Lucy!" yelled the crowd as Lucy hopped past the finishing post. "Well done," panted Dotty. Where's Sad Sack?
I haven't started yet,
said Sad Sack. Oh, really?
I thought if I waited till you were all tired, I'd catch up and beat you all,
explained Sad Sack.
It seemed a good idea at the time.
It was a very silly idea, said Dotty. Do buck up, Sad Sack, and join in properly.
So you get the basic idea here. They have a race or some event. Sad Sack messes up. Dotty tells him off. Rinse, repeat. They go through a number of these events. You know, there's a long jump and a high jump and various others. But let's skip to the denouement, shall we? So there it is. The moral of this story is that it's all right if you're an overbearing, bossy cow, and it's all right if you're a big fat pig, because we'll accept you and celebrate you no matter what. Now here's a medal for you two. Well done, everyone. Well done. Now get out.
Pew, pew, Barney McGrew, Cuthbert Dibble Grubb.
So once again on Deconstructing Boomer Truth, our three characters, Boomer Waylon, Gen X Daria, and Millennial Medicine, will be breaking down this film from 1949. Let's take a little look.
Yes, Jim, what is it?
Well, Mr. Evans, Miss Black wanted me to bring this to you.
Oh? Won't you sit down, Jim? I understand you have an unusual pencil, Jim.
Yes, sir. That is, it's nothing special.
But you're rather proud of it.
It has my name on it. I won it in an essay contest.
May I see it? Personally, I think that something like this is better for carving.
I'll fix the desk, Mr. Edmonds. I'll sand it down and refinish it. You won't be able to tell where I scratched it at all.
That's a good idea, Jim.
I'll begin today after school.
That would be fine.
Well, what else do you want me to do, Mr. Edmonds?
Perhaps you can help me with a problem. I'd like your advice, Jim.
My advice?
Yes, I've got quite a serious problem. There are a great many young people in the school, Jim. Each is an individual, but in one important way, they're all alike. They're all growing up.
Is that the problem, Mr. Edmonds?
Yes, growing up is a problem. Because, well, I remember one time I watched some of the boys play ball. You've probably seen it too. The boys were all about your age. In years, they're young men. But sometimes in their behavior...
They act like children?
That's it. A boy batting struck out, and what a fuss he made. He was a young man in years, but the way he behaved was more in keeping with a 5-year-old. When you see a child do the same thing, you think, oh, well, he'll grow up sometime. But at 15 or 16, this boy was still reacting the same way. He was still showing violent temper when little things went wrong for him. So the question is, why doesn't he grow up? Why does he still behave as a child? How can we help him get rid of these leftovers from childish behavior? That sort of behavior we call an infantile reaction.
So quite a lot of little observations we can make already. First of all, Jim's crime here, the carving his initials into the desk, was considered so serious he was sent straight to see the headmaster, and the school was written a letter by his mother. He immediately owns up to it. He immediately owns it and says, listen, I'll make it better. I'll mend the desk. And yet that is not enough for Mr. Edwards here, who actually wants to go deeper and to make Jim understand the root of the problem. And he does this by empowering Jim to make the analysis himself. And he frames it in terms of helping all of the other pupils in the school, which is a very nice technique from Mr. Edmonds. He actually treats him like an adult, not like a child, which is very interesting. However, there is something else that interests me here, which is that at no point during this story so far does either Jim, his mother, or Mr. Edmonds question the idea that Jim is solely responsible for what he has done. And I think that this is one respect in which their worldview is straightforwardly what I would call Protestant. Jim is expected to feel shame and guilt for his actions. There is no question that it is he, and he alone, that is responsible. Whereas I think all three of our characters, Boomer Waylon, Gen X Daria, and Millennial Madison, would be prone to seeing structural or external factors to blame for what Jim has done. Gen X Daria in particular grew up in a time of incessant psychologizing in which everybody was taught from a young age to think along the lines of Philip Larkin's This Be the Verse. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern, and half at one another's throats. Man hands on, misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. And this essentially Freudian view of the world is something that Gen X Daria swallowed wholesale. And I think that were she watching this, she would immediately start wondering, well, what's going on at home for Jim? Why is Jim doing these delinquent things? What's missing? What has caused this? Or that kid who we see playing baseball, maybe he has unresolved issues, quote unquote. What are his issues? And of course, one of the reasons that Gen X Daria thought along these lines is because her parents were boomers. Her parents were basically a broken generation of people who didn't have a proper moral compass. Which brings us on to Boomer Waylon himself. What would he make of this? And I think, first of all, he would probably be struck by very superficial things, like, for example, how square Jim is. I mean, despite the fact that he's carved his initials on this desk, he's quite obviously a square. He's not hip, this guy. He's very old-fashioned. And I think Boomer Waylon would, be prone to want to make fun of the fact that this is something from 1949. It's old, it's from a bygone generation, and his instinct, I think, is to poke fun of that, because it probably scares him to think too much about what is being said. Millennia Madison, she, or I'm sure, would have already clocked the fact that there are no people of colour here. It's all white people, it's all men so far. It's a male authority figure. Mr. Edmonds is very much, the talking head of the patriarchy. He's an older man. He's a wiser man. He is almost the voice of God in this video so far. And yet the underlying message presents a real problem for Millennial Madison, and to a lesser extent for Waylon as well, because the idea that you should act your age, that you should be mature as opposed to childish, is the exact opposite of their worldview, which is essentially to be an eternal adolescent, to be an eternal child, in both the case of Waylon and in the case of Madison. So I'm not sure how they process this, because some of this must be hitting home. Let's see where it goes.
Infant. Well, whatever it is, it spoils the game for others. Why can't he act his age? I guess scratching a desk spoils it for others, too. Why can't I act my age, eh?
That's what I'd like to know, Jim. Well, you know what to do about the desk. But now this pencil. If you were a first grader, I'd just keep it, wouldn't I?
Oh, but Mr. Edmonds, I'm not a first grader.
Oh, you're not. So suppose you start fixing that desk. Come back for your pencil when you feel you're ready for it.
Yes, sir.
Good night, Jim.
Why can't I act my age? That's a good one. Oh, well. Fix up the desk and forget about the whole thing. Pencil gone? Oh, yes. Maybe one of these pencils will do it. Hey, act your age. No use getting sore. That won't open the can. Hello? Oh, Mr. Olson.
Need some help, son?
Why, yes. Do you have a knife or something to open this?
Yes, I guess so. I'm using yours to carve up a desk, I see.
No, a pencil.
A pencil? Bright crop of young fellows in this school. Every day think up a new way to act like babies. Never grow up. Still little boys playing with morals. Pencils, knives, pulling girls' hair. Well, there's no sense in cleaning up here until you're through. I'll come back later.
Now, this is a superb example of social pressure and social shame in action. The message of Mr. Edmonds has now been reinforced by somebody else in the community and somebody lower down in the hierarchy, the janitor. Now, just imagine this exact scenario today. If Jim, for example, was a young man of color, would the school be empowered to do this? What would happen to the janitor if the janitor gave that exact speech to the kid who was already in trouble and already in detention for doing this? I wonder whether there might not be complaints put into the school about a janitor who spoke to a people like that today. But in any case, I think Boomer Waylon may be starting to get a bit frustrated with this whole scenario. He's like, well, the kid is already serving his penance. He's already sorting out the desk. So this is overkill now. Why is he being made to feel so bad? Man, this is such an oppressive society. This is such a claustrophobic atmosphere for a kid to grow up in. He just wants to be free, to do what he wants, any old time. Why can't you just let the kid be the kid? This is a fascist school, man. And old Gen X Daria, she may be already thinking about the lines of, like, what long-term damage is this going to cause for Jim? This now seems like pretty harsh treatment. After all he did was carve his initials in some desk. And yet, of course, Daria also has some aspect of Jim in herself. So part of her kind of respects what's going on here, because they're the natural feelings that she has felt her whole life, but were effectively denied her by her own parents. In a way, she wishes that her parents had been more like Mr. Edmonds here, but of course that's not to be. And in any case, this is just a shoddily put together propaganda movie from 1949, and real life teachers weren't like this. This is all just idealized. It was never real. So I think Daria would possibly start thinking along those lines to herself in order, in a way, to banish the romantic feeling that there may have been a better time through pure cynicism, which is, of course, her modus operandi. Well, Melania Madison's probably starting to get a bit bored now, fidgeting with her phone or something, but If she was going to say anything more interesting, she may start thinking along the lines of the panopticon of this patriarchy and how it's reinforcing its own bourgeois Protestant values in this young lad, Jim. Quite why those values are bad ones remains to be seen, but I think she may gesture towards an analysis like that. Let's continue.
Still little boys. Playing with marbles, eh? But maybe it's true. Remember what Bill did yesterday. He was sitting right there. I guess he thought no one was looking when he took Jean's notebook. Was he cheating? Probably. And that's a childish thing to do. That's a child's way out. Then there was Phyllis the other day. She seemed to be worrying about something, and when Miss Black called on her, and she wasn't ready with an answer, why, you'd have thought it was something terrible that had happened. She almost cried. Just like a little girl. Yeah, that's it. An infantile reaction. Why don't we act our age? I'm going to talk to Mr. Edmonds again. After school tomorrow.
I've given it a lot of thought, and, well, I'm not the only one, Mr. Edmonds. Everyone seems to act childish sometimes, but I don't understand just why.
Well, it's partly because of the way we grow up. Your body's growing up now, Jim. You're growing much taller these years, but it may be some years more before your shoulders really broaden out and you become fully grown. Growing up emotionally is much the same. Different parts of our personalities grow at different rates. Some of us never grow up entirely.
So one side of a fellow's personality could be grown up, and another still infantile. Is that right?
Yes. For example, you've seen the girl who always has to win an argument. Most of the time she behaves like a young lady, but let someone disagree with her, well, she might just as well be 5 years old. We see reactions like this with young children.
So we might well imagine Millennial Madison getting a little bit triggered at that last one. These are the emotional reactions, the genuine emotional reactions of women trying to fight the patriarchy, being shut down by an oppressive and toxic male patriarchy that just doesn't allow her to express herself. So she's now got a bit of a narrative because there are some women in here, and now she can start to paint a picture of this as being a wrong and bad way of looking at the world. And in fact, I think Boomer Waylon and Gen X Daria would also start to do this, and they'd start to post hoc rationalize why that is in different ways. But it all boils down to the same thing, which is that this film sees growing up and sees acting your age and emotional maturity as, in fact, a form of stoicism, a form of self-control that downplays the emotions, that doesn't allow emotions to vent. You want to put a lid on it and try to rise above it. So in a way, they're appealing to a much more ancient idea of controlling your emotions, of stoicism, something you might see in Seneca or Aristotle, for example. But this is somewhat different from how Boomer Waylon and Millennial Medicine, at least, have been taught. They've always been told that it's better to talk about your feelings. They've been told that it's better to express your emotions, that it's better not to keep anything bottled up. And so essentially, they've been given the opposite advice, to actually act up, to actually be more like children, even as an adult, and that this advice is in some way wrong and repressive. Very interesting to think about that. Now, Gen X Daria, she's a little bit different because even though she has been told this, ever the cynic, she doesn't actually act it out. So she is probably the least emotional of these three characters and the most quote-unquote rational. But even she, because of the psychologizing that I've talked about, would probably start to think about the psychological damage being done by keeping your emotions wrapped up in the way that this film is asking you to do. Maybe it would lead to an uptight society or something like this. Let's continue.
Then there's the fellow who can't take a joke. He laughs as hard as anyone at most jokes, but when the joke's on him, watch out. His 5-year-old brother would react the same way. There's the boy who constantly shows off to gain attention. There's the girl who cries over trifles. Then remember, there's the ball player who becomes violently angry when he loses out. Those are some of the many infantile reactions we see around us every day. They indicate that a part of one's personality isn't growing up with the rest. Now, what we need is some method of measuring our growth, comparing various parts of our personalities.
Say, I have an idea, Mr. Edmonds. I think I can figure out my age. Anyway, I'd like to try.
Just a minute. Don't you want your pencil?
No, sir. I'll wait until I know how old I am.
Let's see. How old am I?
So essentially, Jim devises this test for himself. Then the cleaner comes back in and he takes the test to Mr. Edmonds. And Mr. Edmonds decides to roll this out for the entire school. He gets all of the whole school to do this test. And when I was watching this, I could not help but think that in a strange way, Mr. Edmonds and Jim were coming back from 1949 to cast judgment on all of us. Who of us watching this could truthfully fill out this test and say truthfully that we act our age? And collectively, as a civilization, as a culture, have we been acting our age? We can only think of the responses of Boomer Waylon, Gen X Daria, and Millennial Medicine to a film like this, a very wholesome, a very moral film, to answer that question. We live in a culture that does not ask us to act our age. We live in an age that in many ways infantilizes us, tells us to embrace the child within, rather than to leave childish things behind. Maybe now is the time to stop our arrested development and to embrace the idea of growing up, to embrace the idea of self-control. And perhaps the only way to do this is to get back to a place where we might think of the kindly but yet stern and judgmental gaze of a Mr. Edmonds who we have disappointed, who we have let down in some way. Because Mr. Edmonds is our past, he is our history, he is our forefathers, he is our ancestors, and it is all of them that we have been letting down by acting like children. Now get out. Where did the boomers come from? How were they made? This will be the topic of today's episode.
The suburbs. Almost as much written about as Madison Avenue. And just as much in need of reflection. Like Madison Avenue, life in the suburbs has its good moments and others not so good.
Oh, no!
Discouraged? Disgruntled? Heck no. They're glad to be here. Remember?
This little clip of what life was like before the suburbs is interesting. The film is referring to the poor conditions of inner city housing stock in the 1940s after the Great Depression and World War II. I'm showing you clips now from another archival film, this one made in 1948, which shows the living conditions in Philadelphia around that time. Rather than rehabilitate these areas, it seems that a lot of American cities instituted rent controls. Indeed, this very film was made by the Welfare Board to promote quote-unquote affordable housing. You can see here the sorts of people who were left to the inner cities and why the pull to move to the suburbs became greater as we moved into the 1950s. Government policies in this era, like rent controls as well as social housing projects, retarded construction and investment and turned a lot of inner cities into virtual slum areas, as you are seeing here. Private developers instead bought large lots of cheap land in the middle of nowhere, often in deals with the local governments at state or county level. And then they tried to lure away reasonably well-to-do young families to these new developments. They built cheap, identikit housing and then a car drive away out of town malls. And this is what we'll be exploring in the rest of the film.
Soon to absorb its familiar sounds. These are what Red Book means by its young adults. People in a certain living situation with particular interests and particular goals.
Now let me just note here who we are looking at. The adults you are seeing are members of the silent generation born between 1928 and 1945. The men would mostly have been too young to serve in the war. And this film was made in 1957, when the silent generation were coming of age. Their parents, the greatest generation, or the GI generation, who had fought World War II, were now middle-aged and in all the key seat power. It is the children you are seeing in these scenes who are the boomers. Now, the interesting thing about the silent generation, as we'll see as this film progresses, is that they were generally very cooperative and compliant with the older generation. They were happy to help, so to speak. And one way of interpreting what we are seeing is to some extent the silent generation fitting into a new picture of life painted for them by the greatest generation, who were very paternalistic and in some ways overprotective of their kids. The silent generation seem to be playing out predetermined roles that have been set for them by their parents. There's a relentless drive in this film towards homogenization and conformity, following rules, and to an extent purchasing an identikit personality and lifestyle marked by ease and comfort. From the point of view of the greatest generation, who had known hardship in the Great Depression and the horrors of war, all of this looked very attractive. The silent generation, meanwhile, were eager to please their parents and to play their role in this new picture. They must have had some residual memory of how things used to be, the hard times, so to speak. But note the boomers. They were also part of this picture. They were born into it. They had no memory whatsoever of what preceded this. This was the only world they knew.
School construction, we were talking about that all the time. I think that when they build the schools, you can play.
Well, I'm for classic school meeting. I'd rather have only big auditoriums and gymnasiums and so forth.
Well, you don't educate by an auditorium. Today's you can have those.
Well, you're wrong.
I always know how my children will behave.
That's good.
What do you notice? The little boy who drops the cigarette ash on the floor is not told off by any of the adults in the room. No one seems to care about what he's done. Why would they, when they have an automated vacuum cleaner that makes it so easy to clean up the mess? That is the messaging of this little scene. Nothing is too hard in the new modern way of life. Drop cigarette ash on the floor, no problem. Your mother will just hoover it up in a jiffy. And so we see a pivotal little moment in the life of the young boomer here, in which he is taught that there are in fact no consequences to his actions. He can quite literally mess up and hold no responsibility for what he's done because his parents will take care of it. So the young boomer, much like his parents of the silent generation were, is overprotected, but now it goes a step further. He is also indulged.
So hardly realizing it, they come into their purchasing stage and are off on a wild, non-stop ride. It's a happy-go-spending whirl, reflected in the windows of the suburban shopping centers where they go to buy.
In 1957, the tone of the narrator is so optimistic. These new developments seemed futuristic, almost utopian. There's so much upwards momentum and hope in the air. At one point, we are shown a shot of a rocket and the narrator voices hopes of reaching the moon one day. Everything is new and modern. Leave the past behind. Embrace the new technologies. Embrace the shiny new gadgets. The mall is not seen as soulless or empty. The mass production lines are not seen as homogenizing. Rather, all of this is interpreted as making life easier and more comfortable, as eliminating unnecessary hardship. It's that old Thomas Sowell question, compared to what, that you have to keep in mind. And the makers of this film knew a harder life, even if the boomers who grew up in this era did not. But it is also not difficult watching these scenes to understand why the boomers themselves started to react against all of this conformism, why they longed for some sense of individuality, why they felt something was missing. Thus far in this series, I've been very critical of the boomers for their shallow selfishness and their endlessly narcissistic self-indulgence. But now imagine growing up in a faceless suburb with this plastic, hollow mall as your only real outlet or entertainment beyond the television set. Maybe you too might long to travel to India to find yourself, or to reject the man.
Like the rest of life in suburbia, shopping has a family flavor.
Do you remember what size she was? 5. Then we bought a tree to go with it.
Yes, that was pretty nice.
I didn't know. Shall I take it?
These busy families make the shopping centers look young and colorful. They have a let's go see quality that brings crowds to community events and promotions. For the children, whom the young adults have always at hand, there's plenty to do and see. While his family shops, a boy can catch a fish, ride the rides, go to the circus, visit the center zoo, and have his hair cut. And if that doesn't tire him out, his mother can put him in the center's nursery school, where he can get paint on his shirt, see his friends, and wear himself out on the bars. Since these young adults seem to be able to outlast their children, they stash them away at a neighbor's house and go back to the center for more.
And now the little boomer is, quote, stashed away at a neighbour's house as the parents go back to the mall for more gaudy entertainment. And what we see here is that in many ways the silent generation were the first generation to be marketed to directly as young adults and as teenagers. And there's a certain sense of entitlement that comes from this type of consumerism. The advertiser tells you that you, the 21-year-old or the 18-year-old or the 16-year-old or the 12-year-old even, are important, that your opinion matters, that your tastes and your preferences are going to be pandered to. So one sees also where the narcissism and the entitlement of the boomer very likely came from. The very source of their dissatisfaction in their souls, the plastic conformity of consumerism, which they railed against, was also the origin of their selfishness. But unlike the cynical Gen Xers who came after them, the boomers had been taught, as we have seen here, to be hopeful for the future, to be optimistic. And so their dissatisfaction with conformity, their yearning for individualism, also came laced with a naive idealism which manifested itself in the hippie nonsense of the 1960s. Of course, the music of that time was made not by boomers, but by the artistic silent generation, who, while conformist in their everyday lives, showed their more rebellious side in the art and the culture they produced. They taught their kids this streak of rebelliousness while taking everything their own parents had taught them for granted. After all, the silent generation would only have a dim memory of the hardship from their childhoods, and most of the world they had known were the good times. In many ways, it was the silent generation who created the ideals and the products which were directly marketed to the boomers. And then, when they were older, in positions of power, it was the silent generation who failed to protect and defend our institutions from insurrection by boomer radicals. Of course, they were always going to indulge the boomers. Why break the habit of a lifetime?
To give these serious young adults the substance they want, to build a durable relationship with each reader, Redbook edits for one person at a time.
As with the slogan of Redbook magazine's national campaign for easy living, the silent generation wanted an easy life. In many cases, they took the path of least resistance. They were only too happy to fit in with the picture painted for them by their parents, helping out in fulfilling their prescribed roles. They registered discontent only in a passive-aggressive way through art and popular culture. They were not going to stand up directly to the great war heroes of their parents' generation. And in fact, you can see the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, for example. You can see that the greatest generation collectively gave the rock bands of the 1960s a pat on the head and a well done. In a strange way, the silent generation's music acts of the 1960s were not all that rebellious. They got the seal of approval from the GIs. They did what the silent generation did best. They appeased. They appeased both their parents and their children. To take the example of the Beatles, you do not sell 585 million records in less than a decade if you're not in some way ratified by the establishment. Perhaps this is why, by the 1970s, genuinely boomer artists such as David Bowie were writing lines like, "And my brother's back at home with his Beatles and his Stones. We never got off on that revolution stuff. What a drag. Too many snags." Or how about Joe Cocker? "London Calling, now don't look at us. Phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust." One has to remember that the boomers were mostly young teenagers in the 1960s, and so of course they would come to reject some aspects of the pre-packaged revolution that their parents' generation was trying to give them. Unlike the Beatles, acts like David Bowie or The Clash were perfectly prepared to shock and appall the sensibilities of Middle America and Middle Britain. The boomers, while undoubtedly selfish and narcissistic, were never the appeasers that their parents were. For the damage that they caused when they were adults, join me next time when I'll be looking at what made Generation X the way they were. Now get out.
Writing for young adults, Redbook's editors have to keep learning and analyzing. Without too much crystal ball gazing, Redbook's editors have to keep an eye to the future.
Are you going to the dance tomorrow night? Yeah, my dear, my homework.
There is a whole new generation coming, soon to be young adults. A bigger than ever market of people who have a history of their own, who remember all the way back to Eisenhower, who probably never saw their mother use a ringer, think automobiles are household appliances, and have reserved seats on the next rocket to leave the Earth.
The earliest members of Generation X would have been teenagers in the 1970s. This was a period in which pop culture was seeking and destroying every last taboo that it could find. Religion, specifically Christianity, was routinely mocked.
The Pope, discussing the existence of God with an out-and-out atheist, starts off very correctly, discussion, and as the hours go by, it gets more and more heated, and eventually the Pope turns to the man and he said, "The mom! Get the mom! And you, come here. You are like a man who is totally blindfolded in a dark room looking for a black cat that is not there." The fellow said, "With all respect, Your Holiness, I think there's great similarity between us both." He said, "What do you mean, similarity?" He said, "Well, as far as I am concerned, you are like a man who is blindfolded in a totally dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. The only difference is that you found it."
Men dressed in women's clothes and wore makeup. Gay themes penetrated song lyrics. Hedonism and debauchery seemed to be the order of the day. The individualism of the freak and the outsider were in, while the banal conformity of the 1950s was out. Only, of course, if everyone dresses up as a freak and an outsider, that makes those things the new banal conformity. But let's not worry about all that. By 1979, the more intellectual members of the older Gen X generation could try to fool themselves into believing that they were above all of that by listening to the likes of Pink Floyd. But then there came the war. And let's have a think about some of these lyrics.
If you don't eat your meat, you can't have any pudding. How can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat? You, yes, you laddie. Poems, everybody. The laddie
Now, there's a grain of something truly radical to this song, the idea that state school is a form of prison, forcing kids through a syllabus of ideological left-wing indoctrination. But unfortunately, this is de-emphasized for the merely psychological. Roger Waters settles for pathology. He's more worried about the possible psychological harm done to children who suffer the, quote, dark sarcasm in the classroom. In other words, he's worried about how school might affect the ego and self-confidence of individuals rather than how it might be brainwashing them. And this incessant psychologizing is characteristic of what would become the Gen X mindset. It is rife, for example, in the movies of Tim Burton. In his hands, the Penguin is the victim of child abandonment, while Willy Wonka owns a chocolate factory because his father was an evil dentist who wouldn't let him eat chocolate. And lo, how all the mystery and charm is stripped out of the thing because it has been explained by this leaden logic. All of this is embodied in an icon of the later Gen X, Daria. Daria was very cynical and a deadpan snarker. In fact, there were many deadpan snarkers for Gen Xers like her to look up to. I'd say it was actively encouraged. Bill Murray, in every film, was a deadpan snarker.
Yes, it's true. This man has no dick.
Ned Ryerson? Bing! Bing! So did you turn pro with that belly button thing, Ned, or
No,
what?
Phil, I sell insurance.
What a shock.
Do you have life insurance? Because if you do, you could always use a little more. Am I right or am I right or am I right? Right.
Ned, I would love to stand here and talk with you, but I'm not going to.
Fraser was a deadpan snarker. Clarissa Explains It All was a deadpan snarker.
Time sure flies when you're having fun.
Blackadder was a deadpan snarker.
Millionaires Row. Hello, room 12 of the Budley Salterton Twilight Rest Home for the terminally short of cash.
Is it any wonder that the people who grew up watching all this snark then proudly declared that their favourite member of the Top Gear crew was James May, as if this made them unique or special in any way? Well, let me tell you, James May is supposed to be your favourite, and it doesn't make you unique or special. Anyway, back to Daria. As well as being a deadpan snarker, she was also, I'm afraid to say, a chronic midwit. What do I mean by that? Well, Daria had an explanation for everything, and that explanation was usually some form of cod psychologizing, as I've already discussed. Something as profound and wonderful and enduring as strong religious faith becomes, in Daria's hands, mere pathology. There's a psychological need for religion because the human mind cannot stand the vast chaos of space and physics, or it cannot come to terms with the great unknown, or something. Daria knows better, of course. Daria has no such psychological need.
Will you never rest? Find a battle who could care less.
Daria was able to take almost anything and explain it away like this. Any idea of coordinated action, for example, let's say a group of people planning some operation on a national or international level, well, that's simply a conspiracy theory. You see, people are incompetent and stupid, so such planning is simply beyond them. What is it that Daria loves to say? Let me quote, "Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity." As often as this line is quoted, it is much less frequently noted that it was originally submitted to a joke book. Why did something considered to be a joke become received wisdom by the 1990s? That's a question for you to answer. Anyway, by the 1990s, Generation X, in their wisdom and cynicism and lack of faith, became the most hedonistic and stupid generation ever to walk the earth.
She's a nasty hoe who slept with my man. I've been with him for the last 4 years, and she just needs to lay back.
What does he say about her?
He says that he doesn't like her.
But that was it. But when you said, then why did you said to him, why did you sleep with her?
Yeah, I asked.
And he says why? Why did he sleep
He
with
said old feelings came back.
her? Oh, But he tells you he loves you?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's meet her. Here is Christy. Christy, welcome to the show. What do you want to say to Emmy?
Emmy, you need to back off. If he loved you,
So,
no, Bits, if you liked you, you'd have the ring on your finger, huh?
I have one too.
Yeah.
so wait a second.
Too bad that was the ring he was going to give me.
Yeah, that's why he was with me last night.
Oh, yeah. That's why he's been with me the last 2 weeks. Every single day.
But, yeah, he's been with me.
Why
he tells me he loves me.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Well, why do either of you put up with him if he's sleeping with both of you? He was with you last night, you're saying?
Yeah.
And when was the last time he was with you?
2 nights ago.
Meanwhile, the television kept affirming the viewer at home that the opposite was the case. Shows such as Mythbusters used science to confirm the fedora hat-wearing Gen X midwit in their view of themselves as enlightened and above the silly superstitions of old. Shows such as QI seduced the Gen X midwit into believing that they had some special tidbit of information, some special insight above and beyond everyone else.
Tonight, any flamencos you give in Pyong score Barney, and I'll also give you 2 Sundays. It's Cockney rhyming slang. Any flamencos?
Flamenco
Dancing answers in Pyongyang slang.
Score Barney, rubble, double.
Yes.
I'll give you 2 Sunday roasts, posts.
Sunday joints, points. If at any nickel and dime time, woman who does buzz.
Only, of course, everybody else watched QI too, so they had the same bit of information. The Gen X Daria sits luxuriating in her own ironic, detached, smug, self-satisfied midwittery, and she imagines this. She imagines this. She imagines this. But the truth is that Generation X was asleep at the wheel. Irony is debilitating and prevents faith, which is necessary for heroic will and action. Generation X has been weak and cowardly and indecisive, which is why boomers and millennials have walked all over them their whole lives. Snarky cynicism and a lack of faith are simply cowardice by another name.
Major boredom singing whatever and never, amen. You're such a big star to me. You're everything I wanna be, but you're stuck in a hole, and I want you to get out. I don't know what there is to see, but I know it's time for you to leave. We're all just pushing along, trying to figure it out, out. All your anticipation pulls you down. When you can have it all, you can have it all.
It is now a cliche to say that the millennials are the me generation, but that does not make it any less true. While the defining features of this most cursed of generations are undoubtedly narcissism and entitlement, it strikes me that they come laced with a curious combination of insecurity and vacuousness. What we have been witnessing is a strange sort of self-help culture, which was summed up best by this 3-sentence summary of a Bruno Mars song called Just the Way You Are. I will read it in full. Nope. No more changes. No more self-improvement. Just learn to embrace yourself in whatever phase of life you're in. You're amazing just the way you are. This small paragraph seems to be what passes for millennial philosophy.
Stop being so hard on yourself. It's not good for your health.
On the face of it, this seems like millennial self-obsession, but dig a little bit deeper, and what do we find?
Because you know I'm all about that bass, no trouble. I'm all about that bass, no trouble. I'm all about that bass, no trouble. I'm all about that bass.
It's a generation that says it's okay to gorge oneself like a hog, as long as we justify it by saying it's all about the bass, or some other such self-serving nonsense.
They say I'm nasty.
It's a generation that tells itself it's okay to slag around because, hey, that's just who I am.
Every day is so wonderful, and suddenly it's hard to breathe. Now and then I get insecure from all the pain. I'm so ashamed. No matter what they say.
It's a generation that tells you that you're beautiful no matter what they say.
And everything around her is a silver pool of light. People who surround her feel the benefit of it. It makes you count. She holds you captivated in her palm. Suddenly I see. This is what I wanna be. Suddenly I see. Why the hell it means so much to me.
It's a generation that tells you that you hold the world in the palm of your hand if you want it enough and if it means enough to you. But, you know, don't go making any changes or self-improvements to get it because, you know, you're worth it just as you are. And now what's this? A unicorn.
Don't be a drag, just be a queen. Don't be a drag, just be a queen. Don't be a drag, just be a queen.
That's right, Lady Gaga is telling you that she was born this way, and that's okay. It deserves to be celebrated because, you know, everyone is born a certain way, and that's just her truth, you know, or something.
I wish I could tie you up in my shoes, make you feel unpretty too. I was told I was beautiful, but what does that mean to you?
Don't judge me. Just don't judge me. You dare make me feel like I need to be held to any sort of objective standard. Just back off, man. Such a drag.
I stare at my reflection in the mirror. Why am I doing this to myself?
But what is it that you see in the mirror, Jessie? Did you actually self-reflect? Did you stop and think that the answer might just be taking responsibility for your own actions? No, I didn't think so. In this void, in this cultural miasma, where can one find salvation? Where can one find any sort of meaning at all?
I felt like there was something missing in my day-to-day life. So I quickly opened the wardrobe, pulled out some jeans and a t-shirt that seemed clean, topped it off with a pair of old shoes that were ripped around the seams. And I thought these shoes just don't suit me. Hey, I put some new shoes on and suddenly everything's right.
I guess that's it then. Off to Clark's, I suppose. Could do with some new shoes. When I published my last video, which was on millennials and their culture of self-love, which calls for them to embrace themselves just as they are, I felt that there might be something missing, and when I read the comments, it seems I was not alone. A few people seemed to think there was some further elaboration required, and I'm inclined to agree. One avenue that I did not fully explore was a short observation I made in passing, which is that the endless self-affirmation and narcissism of the millennials seems to belie a deeper-seated feeling of insecurity. I discussed this with Mrs. AA, and this is what she said.
On the one hand, millennials are being told to embrace themselves and boldly go forth and enjoy their lives. On the other hand, their teenage angst and insecurity is being engaged, reflected back, and in so doing, amplified by their idols and role models. The likes of Jessie J and Christina Aguilera are saying, "We relate, we feel this way too." That's reassuring on one level, but also dumbfounding. You're just like me with my difficulties, but actually I'm nothing like you. I don't have your looks or your talent or your sexiness. I must really be worthless. On the other hand, if you can accept yourself for who and what you are, then you are cool, self-assured, and right now. The need to forge an identity sets added pressure to navel gaze, to spend yet more time looking in the mirror and asking yourself, who am I? No wonder the millennials take on a quality of insecurity, entitlement, and a superficiality devoid of any truly unique purpose. Where the Gen Xers were told, "Don't bother, it's not like you can really make a difference anyway," the millennials, who have been by equal measure pandered to, indulged and manipulated by those who market to them, are told, "You can do anything you want, as long as you don't judge yourself or anyone else, because judging is bad, and as long as you are yourself. And by the way, you are yourself if you're wearing the right clothes that reflect your own unique identity." The Gen X's insecurity comes from being told they'll never amount to anything. The millennials' insecurity comes from manipulative mixed marketing messages that lead to a feeling of conflict about themselves, their purpose, and their identity. In the 50s, the aspirational message was to create the perfect nuclear family. The next generation naturally rebelled, as all generations do, seeking to liberate the individual from any societal pressure to conform. They were a generation that created and destroyed, for the two go hand in hand. Following that, the Gen Xers shied away from anything radical, were practical and pessimistic in outlook. The millennials inherited the narcissistic tendencies of the boomer generation and the insecurity of the Generation X that preceded them. All generations inherit a mix of the characteristics of the preceding two, though their trademark is the manner of how they rebel against the previous generation. It is in understanding this natural inclination to rebel that marketers can set fashion and drive the cultural agenda, ultimately informing the lens through which generations self-identify and behave.
When I was growing up, there were 4 channels on television. This globe you can see here represented something like the centre of the culture. One might scoff at the idea of something as trite as television being at the centre of things, and justly so. But perhaps I grew up in a time of triteness. BBC One was our gateway, not only into what was hip and happening in the present, but also a gateway into the past.
Now on One, we continue our season of films charting the years from 1939, when Britain was at war. This afternoon, John Mills, Bernard Lee and Richard Attenborough star in the epic film of Dunkirk.
Now, Generation Z, or Z if you're American, or if you prefer, Zoomers, did not have the fortune, or if you prefer, misfortune, of growing up in such a time with a centre. Whereas I can remember the 56 KB AOL dial-up internet of the late 1990s, and indeed life before that, the Zoomer has lived their entire life online. Whereas I can recall a generally homogeneous culture with a centre, even if that centre was something as spiritually bankrupt as Blur versus Oasis or Manchester United winning the Premier League. For the Zoomer, culture has always been fragmented, heterogeneous, decentered, and on demand. Consequently, the typical Zoomer probably knows a lot about something specific and niche, let's say Japanese cartoons, while knowing absolutely nothing about culture more broadly. This is not because the Zoomer is an idiot, but rather because they have not had the opportunity to be sufficiently centered and grounded in a particular cultural mode. They are a monument of a failed education system and to the prior generations who have failed to pass on their heritage. Superficially, the Zoomer shares some characteristics with the cynical Gen Xer. Your typical Zoomer likes to say cringe, but unlike the Gen Xer, who has made peace with their cynical worldview, from which they derive a kind of certainty and therefore security, the Zoomer lacks sufficient grounding adequately to understand irony or sarcasm. Rather, the word cringe, for them, is adopted as a style and a defense mechanism against anyone looking too deeply at their insecure foundations. This search for a centre also manifests itself in a certain full-on quality when the Zoomer thinks they have found one. They might easily oscillate to the extremes, whereas some people might have a single road to Damascus conversion in a lifetime. Zoomers might have 3 or 4 in a single year. Now I'm a communist, now I'm a fascist, now I'm a traditional Catholic, and so on and so forth. In fact, if we take the conventional political compass, Gen X Daria, in her cynicism, aims to avoid the extremes, which all require much too much of a leap of faith for her, and so she sticks to that little box around the centre, while the Zoomer is likely to occupy all 4 of the extreme corners. Because Zoomers do not want to draw attention to their own uncertainty and yearning for a centre, they have a number of copes and defence mechanisms. One tactic, for example, is to claim that nobody else gets them. That to get being a Zoomer, one has to be a Zoomer oneself. To get Zoomer humour, one has to be a Zoomer oneself.
Who painted the Mona Lisa? Mona Lisa. Yeah. Da Vinci?
What's that, Rick? I love my grandkids. Oh, psych. Just kidding. My new catchphrase is, I don't give a just I'm Pickle Rick!
Ask me if I'm a truck.
Are you a truck?
Bitch. Corvette. Hop in a motherfucking jet like that. Him and that, him and that like that. They were like, Pop, why you all like that? Why you tall like that? Why you all like that? I'm off for Eddie, I'm
Well, I think it's safe to say that the other generations aren't exactly missing out, are they? This defence mechanism is, of course, a feeble bid for uniqueness, which is rightly mocked by everyone else. But one suspects that there is a genuine creativity and playfulness in the Zoomer that is utterly lacking in their earnest millennial counterparts, and it is more joyous than the purely negative, deconstructive tendencies of Gen X. It is also much too early to say what Zoomers will do or achieve, since they are still young and yet to mature. One suspects that they will form a type of cultural resistance to whatever hegemony the overbearing millennials try to impose on them, just as the silent generation did to the greatest generation in the sphere of culture. And I think that the Zoomers will operate in the realm of culture more than politics. We're still seeing the consequences of that cultural revolution that the silent generation ushered in the 1960s today. So to see the consequences of what the Zoomers will do in the next decade, you'll probably have to fast forward another 70
or 80 years.
Ask me if I'm a truck.
Are you a truck?
Ask me if I'm a truck.
Are you a truck?